Amy, one of the things I learned after living overseas for several years and then working in international development, a disaster isn't always a disaster. I mean by that, a storm or an earthquake can strike one location and just cause tremendous loss of property and life. But a similar storm or earthquake can strike another location, and it's really just an inconvenience for the people that live there.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. And yet I have seen firsthand the destruction of a massive hurricane where entire blocks and buildings have just been leveled. And so I agree with you, Holland. The spectrum of disaster ranges from, knocking out supply chains, which we know a little bit about that now, having to relocate, to just experiencing a windy day. So we may not be able to change the weather, as we have discussed on an earlier episode. We can alter its effects on human life and our community.
Hi, I'm Holland Webb.
Hi, I'm Amy Boland.
And you're listening to The Afterword, a conversation about the future of words.
To talk about that, we have Dr. Pravin Bhiwapurkar, an associate professor in the School of Architecture and Interior Design at the University of Cincinnati. Welcome. Did I say your name correctly?
Yes, that was perfect.
Look at that. You gave Amy the tutorial on how to pronounce it. I ended up getting to say it, and I did it without the tutorial.
Well, Holland, you're just much better with language and foreign names.
As soon as I got to that, I thought, oh no, why didn't Amy pick up this line? Okay.
Good job.
Okay, Dr. Pravin, how did you get into architecture? Could you, in 60 seconds, tell us the Cliff Notes version of your life and who you are?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Pravin, and I was fascinated by architecture because I was really interested in knowing how are these buildings in our cities are, related to the warming climate. That is really, that was actually around 95, 93. That is when I started thinking about architecture. And I was actually thinking about what is it that what is the contribution of the buildings in warming the climate? That topic was very new. It was not politicized. And but I was just thinking based on some of my readings and hearing some news clips. Nowadays we have podcasts. I'm sure some people might get excited about that. And then with very limited literature and very poor internet that time in India in around 93, 95, I was looking at this information and found out that there's some work on warming urban climate is being done here in the United States and Australia. So that is what really triggered the idea of pursuing higher education in these countries, and I ended up here in the United States.
Wow, that is exciting. How long have you been here in the United States, Pravin?
So it's been 20 years now, but the whole idea of just thinking about architecture and warming urban climate relationship really triggered my research. I became very passionate about it then, and actually it helped me get full scholarship through India-US exchange program. So I didn't even have to spend any money on my education just because I was very passionate about our topic, architecture and warming urban climate.
Fascinating. That's great. So note to all of those parents out there and students who are looking for scholarships, pick something that's important and be passionate about it. That's awesome. All right. So Pravin, we really need to get down to some brass tacks, if you will. So some of these concepts when we're thinking about, like you said, this is a relatively new topic. So we really need to understand what this topic means. And by doing that, we're going to look at some vocabulary and some phrases. So the first one I'd love you to unpack is urban heat island effect. What is that?
Sure. So this is really this is like a a small version of climate change. Climate change can be understood more at the broader scale, regional scale, national scale. And since I was trying to relate it with architecture, maybe urban areas, that is where I came across this word urban heat island effect. And by definition, it is the difference between urban and rural air temperature. And and by that means is like urban areas, particularly downtown areas, are much warmer than so-called rural or less developed areas. And that rise in temperature is called as, that difference in temperature is called as urban heat island effect. And this effect can vary between different cities, depending upon its size, depending upon its population, depending upon whether it's coastal city or like landlocked city, to variety of factors.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. I love that. The difference between rural and urban air temperatures. That makes perfect sense.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I have a feeling this is going to go along with it. Ecological design.
Sure. So if we know that there is going to be urban heat island effect in the city, then obviously my question was, what is it that architects or architecture can do for that? But before I get into that, so it's like, think of it as a school science experiment. You know, you are trying to combine two elements, and then, you know, in order to accelerate that chemical reaction, you start heating it up, you know. And so that heat really accelerates that reaction and then gives us lots of things, right? Like not only heat, but air pollution. There is a damage to many other parts of the cities. And like water cycle is affected, vegetation is affected, air pollution, and a lot of things are affected. So ecological design, what it does is, then it looks at how can we design a building which accounts for not only architectural, but also the ecological influences of that. And then how can that design actually start mitigating those effects, and in turn, start regenerating some of those ecological processes which were damaged because of the urban hazards or environmental hazards.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, I love that idea about mitigating the damage. Boy, that's important. All right, so I think this is going to flow right into the next word and phrase. How about net zero energy buildings?
So, as we know now, greenhouse gases are the main contributor of climate change, and heat is which is causing urban heat island effect. These are all like driving a lot of energy related impacts that we see and we live in the buildings. For example, urban areas are getting warmer, and in order to beat the heat, we use a lot of air conditioners in the building. And what happens is we remove all the heat from the building. Eventually, it is dumped right outside the building. So that is how that heat is accumulated more at the city scale, and then eventually contribute to the heat island effect. But then our use of additional energy to beat the heat, plus also, our lifestyle has changed. We are using more electronics. We are using more and more energy in buildings. So the whole idea for net zero energy buildings is, how can we design buildings which uses zero energy? And as challenging as it sounds, it can be managed. For example, first step is to really cut down on all the extra energy demands or needs in the building. And then second step is generate energy at the building scale using renewable energy, so that, any energy that you need can be compensated. And then you can say, at the end of the day, there is a zero energy in the building. So that is the concept. So in case, I'm sure a lot of our listeners may have known that there is a lot of photovoltaic panels that cities are promoting. Maybe in some parts of the world, they're using, people are using renewable energy instead of like coal-fired power plants. So they are contributing to the renewable energy, thus actually reducing the overall energy impact of the buildings.
Okay, excellent. So then does that go into this next phrase, high performance buildings and facades?
That is correct. And then question is, how can you design net zero energy buildings? And there are a variety of topics that you can deal with. And then one of those is building facades, because the building skin is something that separates the inside from outside. And so in our architectural terms, we call it as envelope. If buildings are high rise, those are the side walls, which are like facades of the building, are actually the main energy drivers, because they are exposed to sun, outside climate, and therefore designing those buildings, facades could become like skin becomes very important element. It's like our skin. Like we feel very hot or we feel very cold, our skin responds to that. We get goosebumps or we start sweating. That is how our skin, or so-called facade, manages our body temperature. The question is, can we do that in buildings as well, so that we can also make it high performance building?
Okay. All right. Very good. All right. And then our last word, biomimicry.
So this is something that I picked up in last 7 or 8 years by working with some experts in biomimicry. And they were primarily biologists, and they were looking at really how do these designs which exist in nature, like animals, could be plants, they are there by themselves and they are part of the environment. They live in tune with that. So the whole idea was like, what can we learn from these natural designs? And therefore, mimicking some of those ideas is, for buildings, is the term I use as a biomimicry. For example, like trees, they absorb, from sunlight, they produce energy, right? And then they extract water. So that is one really good example. Plus, there are many, many other examples where it's really fascinating world what our living organisms are doing. And question is, using biomimicry as a principle, can we even try to mimic some of those so that, our buildings are so static, it just stays there, without any changes. So can we really mimic something from natural organisms to be, say, more performative, use less energy? Maybe can we learn something in line with ecological designs? So that's how I use biomimicry in that context.
Wow, I love that. I can tell, I can hear your passion about that. So I'm looking forward to having a little bit more of this conversation. But this really helps me understand how this topic is really quite complex. So I really appreciate you giving us a baseline to go on. So thank you.
Yeah, it's a very complex topic. So can we go all the way back to the beginning? Talk about what maybe the most foundational question of them all. What is the purpose of architecture?
Wow, this is such a loaded question. And I've been in teaching and practice world more than 20 years, and I still sometimes it's challenging. I find it challenging to explain what architecture is to my students, to maybe general audience. Let's see if I'm doing justice to this question. I think I would like to just start with very basic function. When we started living in, say, just building to, or say shelters, really to protect from the nature, to be safe from the some outside factors. And so I would say that is really at the core. But then since then, the whole idea and definitions of architecture have evolved so much then it is just not about shelter. It's just not about protection. Then particularly these days, when we spend so much of time in our homes, it is also about personal experience in that building or in that interior or in the room that we are or house that we are in. It is also related to your psychology. Like, we can feel there is outside and there is inside. You feel so comfortable when you are in your home. So there is that personal experience and there is that psychological impact of that architecture. But then just one building or one room is not the architecture. We always live in a world where we are with families, we are in a community. So that is where there is a cultural building. That is where there is a meaning to the life as well. So therefore, from that one building, one space, we can expand it to more at the collective level, where culture and meaning can be part of the architecture. So this was, again, I would say mostly in relation to the interiors, but then from the exterior also, like there is like some kind of a behavior associated with that architecture. We create buildings, it's our behavior, and then sometimes that buildings affect us, they affect our behavior. So that is actually very, very important. And then in the end, again, more at the broadest scale, the architecture is also associated with the social, ecological, and environmental systems that we are actually part of. So it's really, I would say, it's a multi-scalar and multi-dimensional topic, but it can all start with the very simple function that I need shelter, I need protection, but we have really expanded the meaning of architecture so much, it has become a very complex system by itself by now.
Yeah, as you're talking, I'm thinking about those buildings that psychologically make me feel wonderful and psychologically feel yucky.
Right.
I know that's not a technical word, yucky, but you talked about protection from environment or having shelter. How do we see that relationship between architecture and nature? So do you have some examples that you can share?
So another great question, because I think since this is an audio podcast, just imagine you are looking at a prairie, there is a grassland, and there is really nothing in there. And then you're going to design or build a house there, so that will be part of the nature. And then question is there what kind of connection are we making with that nature? For example, can we see outside? Does it respond to the outside factors? For example, does it relate to water? Does it relate to sun? Does it relate to the land? Does it relate to the vegetation? So there are multiple ways of actually looking at this connection, and then topics that all our listeners know quite well that goes in the nature. So in short, I would say it's that meaningful connection of building with the nature is really the relationship between the architecture and nature. In short, architecture should be part of the nature, and it should, in my opinion, it should merge with nature. It should not dominate the nature. It should not add any burden on the nature. It should not be a kind of an independent, isolated element in the nature. So I believe more in like living in harmony, in harmony with nature. I think then probably will be much more ecologically sustainable. So when I was thinking about these examples, when you asked me this question, there is a really very famous architectural firm, Snøhetta, and their project is Egum Tourist Route. Egum, I'll just spell it for you, EGGUM, Egum Tourist Route. You look at that building and, it's so difficult to, make out like where does the nature end and where does the architecture actually begin. So it's a really good example to look at. I mean, there are many, but this is something that I could remember right now. And if you really thinking of like nature, and then thinking of like how can you insert like man-made built component in that, then there is another example, national tourist route, Trollstigen. This is by Royal of Ramstead Architecture, and it's more like a pathway in those rocky landscape and overlooking the valley, overlooking another hills. And then what really makes it really beautiful is, the clouds could be there and sometimes it could vanish, so you feel like you're part of the architecture. But these are very special examples, and many such examples actually exist. And both the examples that I mentioned actually are in Europe. So very good examples to look at if you get a chance.
I just looked up Egum Tourist Route as you were talking, so I could see what it was you were describing online. There's some great photos of that online. But I think you opened up a little bit of a new concept here, and that's environmental sustainability. So if you aren't speaking to architects and you're just speaking to ordinary citizens, what do we need to know about building for environmental sustainability?
Absolutely. And, this is a topic, I guess, now that we are all aware of changing climatic conditions, our audience, younger generation, are very committed to the climatic as well as environmental issues. So therefore, then how does this relate to, say, architecture or the environmental sustainability? So as we've been discussing this topic of like how building need not to be a burden or need not cause any harm to the environment. But then second term is like sustainability. How can we design and build in a way that, there is less and less burden, and then, we can sustain those natural resources for longer time. So in a nutshell, that is how I will relate environmental sustainability. And when it comes to, say, building, so then there are like different themes that we can go with. For example, every building is on a particular piece of land. So how can we optimize that site potential in terms of, again, the natural resources like land to air to water to sun and so on and so forth. And then you design a building which obviously can conserve a lot of energy, because energy is one of the most important factor that we discussed earlier. And then, how can we protect and conserve water on that particular site so that it does not block or it does not, unnecessarily create some kind of knots in a natural energy flows. And with that said, I just realized that in nature, there are a lot of these flows of energy, flows of water. And by adding that building, sometimes, or group of buildings, we actually create those knots, and then, disturb those flows. I think what we are talking about is how can we let those flows continue through our design by protecting and then conserving water and previous topics. And then, obviously optimize the building space and material use, just the design and use what we need. And the materials are part of every building. And sometimes materials can travel many miles before it reaches your home. And then I think looking at the carbon footprint of the material, or say using local materials, is always recommended. And then once all these things are done, are brought in on one site and, created a home, then what is the indoor environmental quality of that so-called environmentally sustainable environment? I think that is equally important, because if it is not good, that is where then we started using more mechanical means like air conditioners, and if it is too hot, and so on and so forth. So indoor environmental quality is another really good topic. And then we also look at like how do you operationalize the building and maintenance, over the period of time. That is another thing. You have a wonderful design, but then if it is not working, with less energy or resources, then it can have a bigger damage. It can have a bigger carbon footprint or unsustainable environmentally. So these are the few topics that comes to my mind right now. But one thing which is not listed generally in architecture is, human behavior is such an important factor. Like, it is always us that, who can make such a change, who can create that change, even in the existing house that we're living in. So I think I would always include humans as a part of environmental sustainability as well.
Excellent point. Excellent point. So let's see if we can capsulize this particular episode. What is an essential element we need to know to understand the relationship between architecture and the climate?
And that's right. And also the environment that building is part of it, like the site potential, right? The vegetation, forest, woods, So you are absolutely right, Amy.
Well, with that, I'd like to say thank you to Dr. Pravin Bhiwapurkar from the University of Cincinnati. This is a great conversation. And while folks wait for part 2, we ask you to please go to theafterwordpodcast.com and become a subscriber. Leave us a review and tell your friends about us. And as always, you are welcome at our table, which we hope is constructed in a way that is environmentally sustainable.